大家好，今天是2024年的10月19号。刚才我发了一个视频啊，主要是给大家去看了一下李显龙啊接受了一个采访啊，主要是他那个采访啊，其实是一个大概挺长的，大概1个多小时，我只取了中间一段啊。他主要是聊国内啊经济的一个情况，他对中国经济的一个看法，当然他还谈了一些其他的。我看了一下下面的评论区啊，很多人就在说，难道我不知道这个新加坡为什么？发展会这么快，我不知道吗？我知道啊，那反正我的理解啊，就是新加坡是在这个中国和美国之间，对吧？在中国、美国之间，两头转啊。那我是这样看，我是这样认为的。你觉着啊，就是举个不恰当例子，你看中国有这么多的这个公司，总部是不是都设在这个新加坡啊？你包括这个海底捞，还有这个叫什么？那个忘了那个名叫什么，反正挺多啊，比较迈瑞医疗啊，老板是不是都在新加坡？你要知道一个问题啊，你就觉着，假如说新加坡他一头全部站在美国这边，你觉着就中国的这些老板他敢去新加坡吗？他敢移民新加坡吗？他担心现在很多的中国老板他不敢，为什么不敢移民美国？他担心跟俄罗斯一样。他担心自己的财产哪一天中美这个态势升级了，这个冲突升级了，那美国的财产安全吗？不安全啊，所以不敢移民美国。为什么敢移民新加坡呢？就是他认为，就这些老板有钱的这个致富小能手，对吧？他们都认为，在新加坡来说，相对来说是安全一点。那也就是他们认为新加坡这个整体的这个政治智慧相对来说是比较好的啊，我是这样觉着的。我们可能普通人啊，你觉得这个政治，反正想当然，但是你要相信啊，这些大佬啊，他这个看未来的这个趋势啊，他肯定比我们看的要准啊。那你要想新加坡他如何能做到？哎，我既不得罪美国，也不得罪这个中国，这个就非常有智慧。你拿这个，你反观这个乌克兰，你就能感觉出来，对不对？乌克兰但凡他的这个一把手，他有这个新加坡一把手的这个智慧，他也不至于打了这3年仗。我不知道有多少乌克兰人到现在打到现在，有没有明白一个问题？打这场仗现在到底是在为谁打？有多少乌克兰人能回答这个问题？这样子吧，就关于这个大国博弈之间啊，就中美之间的关系啊，以及为什么会产生这样的冲突？站在这个新加坡的角度，他们站在第三方，我们来看看这个新加坡前总理李显龙啊他的一个看法。当然，你要知道，他公开场合说的一些话，他绝对不会说他去得罪美国，他去得罪中国。你要知道他的这个站位，他屁股决定了，他只能这样说。我们一起来看一下。
I think China is running into difficulties with some developed countries. Reading from the Western reports, China has always been casted in a negative light. However, if I talk to Chinese officials, they feel under siege.
Yeah.
What are the fundamental problems? Do you think there's anything that China needs to do right, or is it just misperception from the West?
I think the fundamental issue, I wouldn't say it's a problem, the fundamental issue is that China has changed so much from what it was to what it is today. First, the size. When China started its 改革开放 1978, 13届三中全会, it was a very small part of the world economy and a negligible part of international trade. Today, it's 20% of the world economy and 20% of global trade. So anything which China does, whether it's good or it's bad, the impact on other countries is enormous. So the situation has changed. Secondly, China has developed and become much more advanced. In the earlier phase, it was growing, it was exporting, but it was making things which other countries needed, and didn't make themselves. You make clothing, you make belts, buttons, you make lower-end electronics products, assembly of goods. Things which other countries were happy to say, well, it's not economic for me to do, China can do. But now China has moved up. All those products which are labor-intensive and which it used to make are migrating. They're going to Vietnam, they're going to Bangladesh, other third world countries. And China is moving up. And you are making EVs, or China is making EVs, you're making photovoltaic panels, you've got your pharmaceutical industries. You are in industries which are competing with similar advanced industries in the developed economies. So it's a more competitive relationship. And therefore, China's growth in the markets is not just benefiting the consumers, but also impacting the producers in the other countries. And that's difficult. You have to accommodate somehow, but it's difficult. Thirdly, because China's grown and developed so much, its interests around the world have also grown and developed. And not just in scale, but also in the things which you're concerned with. You have strategic interests, you have security interests, you have foreign policy interests in very far away parts of the world. The Belt and Road includes countries in South America. And in Africa, China is very active. So China's interface with the rest of the world is multifaceted. And then the question comes, who's number one, who's number two? How does number one and number two work together? Can you work together? So I think these are objective changes. There's no doubt that for the world, we are much better off with China like it is today than with China as it was 30 or 40 years ago or 50 years ago. But it means that there has to be an adjustment. It's not a matter of right and wrong, but it's in China's interest and it's in the world's interest that this adjustment has to be made. What is the adjustment? It is to acknowledge that the situation has changed. China's heft, its influence, its impact on the world is on a different scale. And you have to make adjustments to the accommodations and the rules which were set up at a time when China was much smaller. If you are a small economy and your exports actually don't threaten any of my industries, I'm prepared to cut you a lot of slack. You can subsidize them, you can protect your own market, you can use all sorts of you can have all sorts of different privileges which the more developed economies have decided not to have amongst themselves. But when you are not so underdeveloped and when you are huge and when your exports can be maybe 80% of the global manufacturing of photovoltaic panels, for example, solar panels, then those concessions are no longer politically tenable. And it has to be worked out, and it has to be renegotiated so that you can have a good basis. I think that's very hard. That's one thing China has to do. On the other side, on the part of the other countries in the world, you have to get used to the fact that there's going to be a very big China in this world, a very powerful and developed China in this world, a China which has advanced technologies, which is going to be world-class in many areas and world-leading in some. And if we have to have some way to induct them into the global system and to accommodate their legitimate concerns and interests. And if you don't do that, and you say, no, I don't want China to be strong, I want it to remain always number 2, or better still, number 2.5, I think that's going to head for a lot of mutual distrust and difficulties. But it's a very difficult adjustment to make, because if you're at 2.5, you wish to become 2, and when you reach 2, you may wish to become 1.5. And so how to have that balance and wisdom to maintain a cooperative relationship which will benefit both sides, I think that takes statesmanship of a very high order on the part of the major powers.
Do you think it helps if China can explain itself better?
I think so. Talking is always useful, but at the same time, there has to be an acknowledgement of the real issues, the hard points, why there are differences with one another, and how we are prepared to accommodate one another. Because if all my claims are indubitable and beyond question, and the other side that says all my entitlements are also beyond doubt, then there's nothing to talk. Or I make you a speech and you make me a speech, and at the end we go away 两面不讨好, both unhappy. So it is necessary to have conversation, but it's also necessary to be able to make the accommodations and to take steps together which can gradually build trust and resolve difficulties. And one of the difficulties is, because of China's size, sometimes China will feel, but the other countries are doing it, why can't I? And the answer is, well, what to do? They are small, you are big. And when you are big, you have greater influence, but at the same time, there comes with it greater responsibilities and the need for restraint, because in a world without an international order, then 弱肉强食, the weak are eaten by the big. And it's the law of the jungle. As Thucydides says, the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. But if the world were like that, everybody is worse off, including the powerful ones, because they will fight each other to the death. So the great countries, the big countries, have to have a certain self-awareness and restraint and say, well, I'm entitled to this if you consult your lawyers and the international law, but I restrain myself. I'm not only aiming to be stronger than others, but to be accepted, respected, and if possible, to have others also admire me and want to have me as my friend. And I think that's a process.
Now the Americans and the Europeans are saying that China's industrial subsidies have led to overcapacity and overinvestment.
Yes.
Do you think overcapacity is a real issue now?
I think in some industries, overcapacity is an issue. For example, steel. There's a worldwide glut of steel, and it happens every so many years. It's the nature of the steel market. Demand waxes and wanes and is never completely in balance. But there are also other industries like EVs or like solar panels, where China has very intense competition and very high production. Solar panels, I mentioned, they are 80% of the global market, and the capacity to produce actually is more than 100% of the demand of the whole world. So I think that is overcapacity. On EVs, if we talk about 内卷, I think EVs are a prime example because there are about 150 companies making EVs in China, and China is a big market, but you don't need 150 different brands of EVs. So in specific sectors, yes, I think there is overcapacity, and some of that will have come from state support and encouragement and financing. But if you take it overall, look at the overall manufacturing sector in China or the overall economy in China, I don't believe there is overcapacity. And IMF has studied this. They published a report recently. So if you look at this manufacturing as a whole, the capacity utilization is respectable, same like in other countries. So there's no overall overcapacity. But that doesn't mean there's no problem. So what is the problem? The problem is China is running a considerable export surplus, balance of payments, exports exceeding imports, trade surplus, and therefore it is having an impact on other economies and manufacturers elsewhere. And there's about 2% of China's GDP, the export surplus, which means there's about 0.5% of the world GDP. And that's not small. So what is the cause of that export surplus? It's really macroeconomics. It comes about because China has a very high savings rate, a relatively low consumption demand from within China. And if you are saving such a lot, you either have to invest all of it in China or you have to export some of it to the rest of the world. And it's not possible at China's present state of development to invest all that 40% of GDP within China, which is its savings rate. A lot of that is invested in building, construction, and the building industry, unfortunately, I think has gone, it went too far, and that is a problem, and that has to cut back. So how do you adjust? Either you boost consumption domestically, or it will be exported, and it will show up as a balance of payments surplus, which means a deficit for the other countries. America has the opposite problem, by the way. America saves too little, spends too much, and therefore has a balance of payments deficit, which is 3% of their GDP. But that's the other side of the problem. On the Chinese side, the solution over time has to be to increase the domestic consumption and bring the economy into a better external balance. It's not so easy to do because it's not just a matter of households spending more, but it's restructuring the economy so that the household earnings can rise, and particularly for those who are not already very, very well off and who will then spend the money. And the households must have the confidence to go out and to spend it, whether it's on travel, whether it's on food, whether it's on clothing, luxuries. They tell me that this year, during the golden weeks, the travel demand is less than in previous years. So that's a sign, but it goes beyond that. There has to be economic restructuring. The Chinese have talked about 国外国内双循环. That means external circulation, you have trade and economic interdependence with the outside world, but within the country, you want to have economic circulation and trade and demand created. And that's a slogan from about 2 years ago, but we haven't seen results yet. It is an important problem because if it's not resolved, for China, never mind the rest of the world, for China, if this is not resolved, you can end up in a very difficult position where you can't get the confidence restored and you can't get the economy moving again. And that's something which I think China can avoid and should work to avoid.
李显龙啊，他说这个中国为什么现在跟美国啊，包括其他国家现在关系不太好？一个重要原因就是他对比了之前和现在啊。之前你的体量比较小，对吧？那别人可能不在乎你。就举个不恰当例子啊，假如说你们班级的这个第一名啊，那假如说你们班里这个第一名啊，你之前啊成绩比较差，基本上是倒数第一或者倒数第二，那你成绩稍微进步了一点啊，你进步了2分3分，你从倒数第一、倒数第二逐渐升到倒数第4、倒数第5，你们班里成绩第一名的人他会在乎吗？他不会在乎啊。但是，一旦啊你的成绩开始到一个第3名、第2名的时候，那他就会非常关心啊，你今天学的什么东西啊？你在看什么书啊？他就会关心，因为他觉得自己的位置不保了。这个就让我。但他的这个想法很好，他的这个想法在我看来可能非常的理想。他觉得双方应该坐下来谈一谈然后怎么样的让大家能互相的接受，就有点像我不知道大家有没有看过一个电影啊，那个电影应该叫《黑社会》吧，梁家辉、古天乐还有那个任华达演的嘛。那个时候不就2个人嘛，一个叫阿乐啊，一个叫大逼啊。一个叫阿乐，一个叫大迪，应该是这样的。那个时候2个人都想竞选这个画师嘛。那一个人，大迪好像没选上之后，他就心里不服，他就提了一个很理想的一个想法，就是社团能不能搞2个双画师？但是你要知道，双画师人可能吗？也就是在我看来有点 这个李显龙有点理想主义，就是这个世界能不能形成一个双化式的一个制度，在我看来好像确实不太容易啊。最后啊有一段这个关于好像这个江苏卫视那个主持人具体名字叫什么，好像是主持那个最强大脑那个人啊，那个主持人啊，提了一个问题啊，就问这个李显龙啊，是关于也是关于中美关系啊，中美关系，然后想问一下，就是李显龙啊，他对中美关系的一个看法，以及对这个新加坡啊，他们觉着哪方面关系比较好处理啊？
如果说是哈里斯当选，或者是特朗普当选，你觉得在处理中美新三边关系当中，哪一个更容易一些？谢谢。
哪一个？
哪一个更容易一些？对您从
容易一些？
对，容易一些。对，
我想都很困难。No, let me explain. I speak in English because I want to speak very carefully. The elections are in 3 weeks' time. I think the hostility, the tensions between China and the US are not personality-based. There are forces, there are deep attitudes which have formed on both sides, and a social consensus on the American side that China is a challenger, a rival, even a threat to America in the long term, potentially. And on the Chinese side, a very deep conviction that the Americans want to stop us from matching them, certainly would not allow us to overtake them, and even overtly say that they would prefer us to be behind them. So this is a very fundamental contradiction which is not going to go away. And on the American side, there are not many issues where the Democrats and the Republicans agree. But this is one.
Yeah.
And that is a very serious matter. So whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump, that's not going to be changing. I think with Harris, it will progress in a more predictable way, with fewer sudden shocks and less risk of things going completely out of control, but that basic attitude is not going to change. With Trump, things can progress in a much more, how shall we put it, in many more sudden directions. For example, he has said that the day after he comes into office, he will put 60% tariffs on Chinese products and 10% on everybody else. And he may possibly do that. It's within his power to do that. And if he does that, you are in uncharted territory. And I think from the record of the previous Trump administration, he will have a team with him who will have certain ideas how they want to do this. And he will depend on the team, but he will also ad-lib and do things which you didn't quite expect him to do. And in particular, I think what you can anticipate is that his attitude towards allies, towards America's friends, will be different from what the Democrat administration has done in these last 4 years. So when they asked the Pope this question, whom he prefers, after he visited Singapore on his way home, the Pope says it's a very difficult question. I don't know how to choose. And if the Pope doesn't know, I don't know either.
Okay, thank you.
这个应该是一个共识，就是不管美国是哪个政党上去，现在中美对抗啊，在新加坡看来已经是一个定局了啊。基本上啊，以目前的态势发展下去，基本上是一个无解啊。这个是一个时代的一个背景啊，我们普通人没法去改变啊，我们只能去接受啊这个事实。好吧，那今天就说到这里，谢谢大家。